My browser just closed out on me. I'm going to continue reading. Demand that all people submit to an equal chance to be killed by a virus. Act out the theatrics of worshipping the virus with fear as the measure of inverted faith. This is why celebrities love this kind of thing. It gives them a chance to debase themselves, to self-flagellate as fellow sufferers. As I write this from my window in New York City at 7 p.m. every evening, people are heard hollering, clapping, and blowing horns from their windows to show solidarity to the healthcare workers on the front lines. Was any such thing ever devised for the mass deaths from opioids? No, they weren't significant deaths for the global elites. It's not death this play is about. It's socialist contagion theology. You can't go to the grocery store without encountering new displays of you-know-what, heroica. How will you say that? Anyway, only viruses interest these people, these haters of liberty. Yet, they refuse to learn the first thing about the natural life of viruses and humans. If they did peer into this world, they would find beauty, truth, and wonder. They would find that viruses are rarely deadly, always misunderstood, and actually trying to protect us. The reason the globalists are obsessed with spread and viruses is because they want to shut down all forms of communication and information exchange that threatens their new world order. Every time somebody takes a swab, a tissue sample of their DNA, it goes into a government database. It's to track us, says David Rasnick. They're not just looking for the virus. Please put that in your article. Technocracy. In HIV, the death spell code came to people in the form of 2 antibody tests called ELISA, I don't know how to pronounce it, and Western blot initially, not PCR tests. They came later to measure viral load and were specifically not to be used for diagnosing HIV. Rather, to stress people out about their surrogate markers, said to represent where they stood in their battle against HIV. Did people really need to be in a battle against HIV? This was the trillion-dollar question. In any case, those tests were not built on a gold standard, which means purification of an actual virus. Purification means the pathogen has been separated from all else. HIV discoverer and Nobel laureate Luc Montagnier, I haven't heard of this person before myself. I'm just reading from this, so I don't know how to pronounce it right. Famously told journalist Jamel Tahif in an interview, I repeat, we did not purify. HIV was never separated from everything else. It was and is a laboratory artifact. A set of lab-tortured antigens around which a test was built. A test which shattered countless millions of lives because people watched TV and believed what they were told. They didn't get a chance to hear what Carrie Mullis or dozens of other real scientists had to say about the supposedly deadly retrovirus, HIV. Nothing was proven before it was asserted. This became the norm, paving the way for the situation we're in now. Global viral communism. We all dreaded this would happen, but we never dreamed they would choose a cold virus. A you-know-what virus. In the early 1990s, PCR, polymerase chain reaction, came into popular use, and Carrie Mullis was awarded the Nobel Prize for it in 1993. PCR, simply put, is a thermal cycling method used to make up to billions of copies of a specific DNA sample, making it large enough to study. As it correctly says on PCR's Wikipedia page, PCR is an indispensable technique with a broad variety of applications, including biomedical research and criminal forensics. The page goes on to say, to my dismay, that one of the applications of PCR is for the diagnosis of infectious diseases. PCR is a needle in a haystack technology that can be extremely misleading in the diagnosis of infectious diseases. The first conflict between this revolutionary technology and human life happened on the battlefield of AIDS, and Mullis himself came to the front line arguing against PCR as diagnostic tool. In 1987, esteemed Berkeley cancer virologist Peter Duesberg had doomed his funding and career by issuing a broadside in a paper published in Cancer Research to the growing and promiscuous assertions made for cancer viruses, including at least one he stood to gain a Nobel Prize for had he not diffused its significance himself. His main argument was that the Gallo-Mantegner fusion virus that came to be called HIV was like all viruses in its class, barely capable of infecting cells. It infected so few cells that the Duesberg likened the pathogenic model to thinking you can conquer China by killing 3 soldiers a day. There was simply not enough there in the form of cell death. It's a pussycat, he said. He even said he wouldn't mind being injected with it, though not if it came from Gallo's lab. With PCR's rise, the HIV industrial complex weaponized it to assert that now they could see HIV more abundantly, hence their malign foe, Peter Duesberg, was toast. Oh no! I coughed. Just an itch in my throat. And it was Kary Mullis himself, an HIV dissenter, who rose to Duesenberg's defense and said, "No, he isn't." I conducted a 2-hour interview with David Crowe, Canadian researcher with a degree in biology and mathematics, host of the Infectious Myth podcast, and president of the think tank Rethinking AIDS. He broke down the problems with the PCR-based you-know-what test in great detail, revealing a world of unimaginable complexity as well as trickery. "The first thing to know is that the test is not binary," he said. "In fact, I don't think there is any tests for infectious disease that are positive or negative." The next part of his explanation is lengthy and detailed, but let's push through. What they do is they take some kind of a continuum and they arbitrarily say, this point is the difference between positive and negative. "Wow," I said, "that's so important. I think people envision it as one of the two things, positive or negative, like a pregnancy test. You have it or you don't." PCR is really a manufacturing technique, Crowe explained. You start with one molecule. You start with a small amount of DNA, and on each cycle the amount doubles, which doesn't sound like that much, but if you double 30 times, you get approximately 1 billion times more material than you started with. So as a manufacturing technique, it's great. What they do is they attach a fluorescent molecule to the RNA as they produce it. You shine a light at one wavelength and you get a response. You get light sent back to a different wavelength. So they measure the amount of light that comes back, and that's their surrogate for how much DNA there is. I'm using the word DNA. There's a step in RT-PCR test, which is where you convert the RNA to DNA. So the PCR test is actually not using the viral RNA. It's using DNA, but it's like the complementary RNA. So logically, it's the same thing, but it can be confusing. Like, why am I suddenly talking about DNA? Basically, there's a certain number of cycles. This is where it gets wild. In one paper, Crowe says, "I found 37 cycles. If you didn't get enough fluorescence by 37 cycles, you're considered negative." In another paper, the cutoff was 36. 37 to 40 were considered indeterminate. And if you got in that range, then you did more testing. I've only seen 2 papers that describe what the limit was. So it's quite possible that different hospitals, different states, Canada versus the US, Italy versus France, are all using different cutoff sensitivity standards of the you-know-what test. So if you cut off at 20, everybody would be negative. If you cut off at 50, you might have everybody positive. I asked him to pause so I could exclaim my astonishment. And yet, it was deja vu all over again. Just like in the HIV battle, people were never told that the HIV test had different standards in different countries and within countries from lab to lab. The highest bar, the greatest number of HIV proteins, was in Australia, 5. The lowest was Africa, 2. In the US, it is generally 3 to 4. We used to joke that you could rid yourself of an HIV diagnosis by flying from either the US or Australia to Africa. But for many years, AIDS in Africa was diagnosed without any test whatsoever. Just a short list of symptoms that tracked precisely with symptoms of most tropical diseases such as fever, cough, and shortness of breath. David, in his quiet Canadian way, dropped a bombshell in his next statement. I think if a country said, "You know, we need to end this epidemic," they could quietly send around a memo saying, "We shouldn't be having the cutoff at 37. If we put it at 32, the number of positive tests drop dramatically. And if it's still not well enough, well, 30 or 28 or something like that, so you can control the sensitivity." Yes, you read that right. Labs can manipulate how many cases of you-know-what their country has. Is this how the Chinese made their caseload vanish all of a sudden? Another reason we know this is bogus, Crow continued, is from a remarkable series of graphs published by some people from Singapore in JAMA. These graphs were published in the supplementary information, which is an indication that nobody's supposed to read them. And I think the authors probably just threw them in because they were interesting graphs, but they didn't realize what was in them. So there were 18 graphs of 18 different people. And at this hospital in Singapore, they did daily you-know-what tests, and they grasped the number of PCR cycles necessary to detect fluorescent. Or if they couldn't detect fluorescence by 37 cycles, they put a dot on the bottom of the graph signifying a negative. So in this group of 18 people, the majority of the people went from positive, which is normally read as infected, to negative, which is normally read as uninfected, back to positive, infected again. How do you interpret this? How do you have a test if a test is actually, 100% positive for detecting infection, and then the negative results must have been wrong? And so one way to solve that is to move to the point from 37 to, say, 36 or 38. You can move this cycle of numbers. It's an arbitrary division up or down. But there's no guarantee that if you did that, you wouldn't still have the same thing. It would just, instead of going from 36 to undetectable and back to 36 or back to 45, it might go from 33 to undetectable to 30 or something like that, right? So if you can't solve the problem by changing this arbitrary binary division, and so basically this says that the test is not detecting infection. Because if it was, like if you're infected and then you're uninfected and you're in a hospital with the best anti-infective precautions in the world, how did you get reinfected? And if you cured the infection, why didn't you have antibodies to stop you from getting reinfected? So there's no explanation within the mainstream that can explain these results. That's why I think they're so important. I couldn't believe my ears, and yet I could. Have you ever tried to read the package insert for a you-know-what PCR test? You begin to feel after a while that the techno-babble is some kind of spell or bad dream. An alien language from another dimension that could not possibly, whatever else it may do, help a single human being have a better life. It's not English. I don't know what it is. I've been quoting Alice in Wonderland a lot recently, David said, because it's the only way I can wrap my head around it. Alice said, "Sometimes I can believe believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. One of the ways to distinguish truth from deception in contemporary science is to track what gets removed. For example, David tells me there was apparently an English abstract online at PubMed out of China that rendered the entire you-know-what testing industrial complex baseless and absurd. There was a famous Chinese paper that estimated that if you're testing asymptomatic people, up to 80% of positives could be false positive. That was kind of shocking. So shocking that PubMed had to withdraw the abstract, even though the Chinese paper appears to still be published and available. I actually have a translation with a friend. I translated it into English, and it's a really standard calculation of what they call positive predictive value. The abstract basically said that in asymptomatic populations, the chance of a positive you-know-what test being a true positive is only about 20%. 80% will be false positive. Doesn't that mean the test means nothing? I asked. The Chinese analysis was a mathematical analysis, a standard. The standard analysis that's been done a million times before. There's no reason to withdraw the paper for any reason. There's nothing dramatic about the paper. It's a really boring analysis. It's just that they did the standard analysis and said in some populations, like they estimated 1% of people are actually infected in the population, you could have 80% false positive. They couldn't do a real analysis of false positives in terms of determining whether a test is correct or not, because that requires a gold standard, and the only gold standard is purification of the virus. So we get back to the fact that the virus is not being purified. If you could purify the virus, then you could take 100 people who tested positive and you could search for the virus in them. And if you found the virus in 50 out of 100 and not in the other 50, you could say that the test is only accurate 50% of the time. But we have no way to do that because we haven't yet purified the virus. And I don't think we ever will. Dave Rasnick has had exchanges with David Crow about this, and Concurs. To my knowledge, they have not yet purified this virus. In a previous interview I did with him a few weeks ago, he said this about PCR tests and the fallacies of thinking less is more, or smaller is better, or more sensitive means more accurate. It's like fingerprints. With PCR, you're only looking at a small number of nucleotide. You're looking at a tiny segment of gene like a fingerprint. When you have regular human fingerprints, they have to have points of confirmation. There are parts of that common to almost all fingerprints, and it's those generic parts in a you-know-what virus that the PCR test picks up. They can have partial loops, but if you only took a few little samples of fingerprints, you're going to come up with a lot of segments of RNA that we are not sure have anything to do with the you-know-what virus. They will still show up in PCR. You can get down to the levels where it's biologically irrelevant and then amplify it a trillion-fold. The primers are what you know. We already know the strings of RNA for the you-know-what family, the regions that are stable. That's at one end. Then you look at the other end of the region for all you-know-what viruses. The Chinese decided that there was a region in these stable areas that was unique to their you-know-what virus. You do PCR to see if that is true. If it is truly unique, it would work. But they're using the SARS test because they don't really have one for the new virus. SARS isn't the virus that stopped the world, I offer. That's right. Okay, so it sounds like they're using a test for something that hasn't even been confirmed to exist and calling it the new one. All right, I'm going to read on. PCR for diagnosis is a big problem, he continues. When you have to amplify it these huge numbers of time, it's going to generate massive amounts of false positives. Again, I'm skeptical that a PCR test is ever true. Crow described a case in the literature of a woman who had been in contact with a suspect case of you-know-what and you-know-where they believed was the index case. She was important to the supposed chain of infection because of this. They tested her 18 times, different parts of the body like nose, throat, different PCR tests, 18 different tests, and she tested negative every time. And then they, because of her epidemiological connection with the other cases, they said, we consider her infected. So they had 18 negative tests and they said she was infected. Now, why was she important? Well, there was only one other person who could have theoretically transmitted the virus if the original patient outside the family was who they thought it was. But secondly, she had the same exact symptoms as everyone else, right? So 4 people in his family came down with fever and cough and headaches, fatigue, and all those kinds of big symptoms. So if she could get those symptoms without the virus, then you've got to say, well, why couldn't everybody else's symptoms be explained by whatever she had? I mean, maybe they ate something bad, seafood or something, so they all got sick, but had nothing to do with the you-know-what. But because 3 out of the 4 tested positive, and then they were all considered infected and out of the same paper. Another interesting thing is that they did a lot of tests. The first person in the list of people tested, he was positive on 3 of the 11 tests. So again, they took nose and throat samples and, different methods and all this kind of stuff. And they got 11 separate tests and only 3 were positive. And of course, all you need to be considered infected is 1 positive test. They could test you 20 times, and if you test positive once, you're considered infected. So a positive test is meaningful. A negative test is like, not so much. I asked Crow what he thought Kary Mullis would say about this explosion of PCR insanity. I'm sad that he isn't here to defend his manufacturing technique, he said. Kary did not invent a test. He invented a very powerful manufacturing technique that is being abused. What are the best applications for PCR? Not medical diagnostics. He knew that, and he always said that. Our conversation went in many different directions, and I plan to publish the entire audio interview. I asked David what he thought was happening here at the most core level. I don't think they understand what they're doing, he said. I think it's out of control. They don't know how to end this. This is what I think what happened. They have built a pandemic machine over many years, and as you know, there was a pandemic exercise not long before this whole thing started. I just want to identify who sponsored that simulation conference 6 weeks before the first news broke out of you-know-where. I interjected. It was the Bad Guy Foundation. Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security and the World Economics Forum, which I'm sure they're just bad too. They're all bad. Anyway, back to my reading. Incidentally, all the stats, projections, and modeling you see in the media are coming out of Johns Hopkins. Right. So this beautiful pandemic machine is a lot like, let's use an example of an aircraft simulator. Okay, so pilots are tested on an aircraft simulator. So if you're flying along in an airplane and there's a loud bang and you see smoke coming from the engine on the right-hand side, this is probably the first time a pilot has ever been in an airplane that had an engine failure. But he's tested this scenario 25 times on an aircraft simulation. So he knows exactly what to do without being told. He goes through the procedure. He doesn't have to think. He just does the steps that he's been taught through the aircraft simulation, and he successfully lands the airplane with 1 engine. So a pandemic simulator is just like that. You sit down at the computer, you see the virus going around the world, and you say, okay, so what we need to do is we need to dress everybody in protective clothing. We need to quarantine everybody who's positive. Next step, we need to do social isolation. It's a mathematical model. And at the end, you always win, right? So in the end, the good guys win and the pandemic is defeated. But there's never been like an actual real pandemic since they built this machine. So there's this huge machine, it's got a red button on it, and it's like if you ever detect a pandemic starting, you press the red button. We don't know exactly what happened, but I think the Chinese government was embarrassed because they were being accused of covering up a pandemic. They said, okay, we want Western approval for our medical system, so we're going to press the goddamn red button. Or they did. And then everybody followed from that. The problem is that the simulation was never based on reality. In another part of our conversation, he said something unforgettable. So we've essentially been taken over by the medical Taliban, if you like. I pressed him one last time. David, in conclusion, finish the sentence. The PCR test for you-know-what is as good as... His reply made me laugh. I don't know I still could laugh. It's as good as that Scientology test that detects your personality and then tells you need to give all your money to Scientology. Celia Farber is half Swedish, raised there, so she knows socialism from the inside. She has focused her writings on freedom and tyranny with an early focus on the pharmaceutical industry and media abuses on human liberties. She has been under ferocious attack for her writings on HIV/AIDS, where she has worked to document the topic as a psychological operation and rooted in fake science. She is a contributor to Uncover DC and the Epoch Times, and has, in the past, written for Harper's, Esquire, Rolling Stone, and more. Having been gravely injured in legacy media, she never wants to go back. She's the recipient of the Semmelweis International Society Clean Hands Award for Investigative Journalism, and was under such attack for her work, she briefly sought protection from the FBI and NYPD. She is the author of Serious Adverse Events, an Uncensored History of AIDS, and the editor of The Truth Barrier, an investigative and literary website. She co-hosts The Whistleblower Newsroom with Christina Borgeson on PRN Fridays at 10 a.m. Oh, and here's another YouTube video attachment.
The line between disinformation and misinformation is not always an easy one to find.
Governments need to be willing to do things that are out of their historical perspective.
Oh yeah, this is Event 201.
For the most part, it's really a war footing that we need to be on.
It can happen quickly. A Marshall-type plan, don't mean to say that exactly, but a Marshall plan that can go into effect can stimulate change very quickly.
The distrust relates to the health system more generally.
A step up from the part of the government on enforcement actions against fake news.
I think a couple of things we have to consider are, even before this began, the anti-vaccine movement was very strong, and this is something specifically through social media that has spread.
Welcome to Event 201.
Hi everyone, I'm Spiro, and what you just witnessed were highlights from Event 201, which took place in New York City on October 18th, 2019. Event 201 is a high-level pandemic exercise hosted by the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security in partnership with the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now, in this report, I will play several clips from Event 201, but I will provide the links below so you can see the pandemic exercise in its entirety, which is nearly 5 hours if you wish to do so. I personally watched every second of it. Now, I believe that this report is directly connected to my recent report on global institutions and governments which are currently pimping the United Nations Climate Agenda program, which seeks to consolidate political and economic power into the hands of the ruling elite. That report is titled The UN and Central Banks, a Rockefeller and Rothschild Coup. And the follow-up to that report, exposing how George Soros is actively bankrolling campaigns to censor content creators on YouTube, which question the legitimacy of man-made climate change, which in my view, based on my research, is nothing more than a false pretext for global regulations, global taxations, consolidation of power and natural resources, in addition to population control and global governance. Now back to Event 201. I find this extremely fascinating because this pandemic simulation exercise of the coronavirus took place about 6 weeks before the first illness from the coronavirus was actually reported in Wuhan, China. Now that is one hell of a coincidence if you ask me. I'm not sure if you believe in that sort of thing. I have a hard time believing in coincidences. Another fascinating connection is the fact that not only did Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation participate in and help set up the pandemic simulation of the coronavirus outbreak, they also just so happen to fund the very group who owns the patent to the deadly coronavirus and are already working on a vaccine to solve the current crisis. Again, an incredible coincidence, I know. Now, the members of the Emergency Epidemic Board in this simulation consist of representatives from major banks, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Johnson & Johnson, logistical powerhouses, the media, as well as officials from China and Americans' Center for Disease Control, just to name a few. Now, this simulation also includes news reports, which were fabricated just for this exercise. Please keep that in mind because they are eerily similar to reports we are currently seeing regarding the real-world coronavirus outbreak. Now, in the spirit of transparency, I have edited some of the clips only due to time restraints to shorten them. After all, this exercise lasted between 4 and 5 hours, so I condensed as much of the material as I could. Now let's take a quick look at how this simulation began.
Hello, everyone. I'm Anita Cicero, Deputy Director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, and today I will be your Master of Ceremonies for Event 201. On behalf of our center and our partners, the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the goal of the Event 201 exercise is to illustrate the potential consequences of a pandemic and the kinds of societal and economic challenges it would pose. Today's scenario is going to simulate meetings of a multi-stakeholder group called the Pandemic Emergency Board. This board has been urgently convened by the World Economic Forum, and Johns Hopkins has been asked to moderate the board meetings and provide expertise during the board's deliberations. The mission of the Pandemic Emergency Board is to provide recommendations to deal with the major global challenges arising in response to an unfolding pandemic. The board's recommendations are aimed at top decision makers in national governments, global business, and international organizations.
The scenario you will be presented with this morning could easily become a shared reality one day. I fully expect that we will be confronted by a fast-moving, highly lethal pandemic of a respiratory pathogen.
It began in healthy-looking pigs, months, perhaps years ago. A new coronavirus spread silently within herds. Gradually, farmers started getting sick. Infected people got a respiratory illness with symptoms ranging from mild flu-like signs to severe pneumonia. The sickest required intensive care. Many died. At first, the spread was limited to those with close contacts, healthcare personnel, co-workers, and families. But now it's spreading rapidly throughout local communities. International travel has turned local epidemics into a pandemic spanning the globe. Just 3 months ago, CAP started in South America, but has now reached several countries with more than 30,000 cases and nearly 2,000 deaths.
Now, this pandemic simulation was broken up into 5 segments ranging from transportation and trade to communications and continuity of infrastructure. Some of the most shocking material is in segment 4 regarding communications. Let's take a quick look. Again, this is a simulation of a coronavirus outbreak which took place only 6 weeks before the actual coronavirus outbreak.
Global health experts have highlighted that dis and misinformation are wreaking havoc on the CAP's response. Health workers are under attack in a number of locations due to rumors that they are purposely spreading the disease. And response efforts in many places have had to be suspended because of concerns around violence. Pharmaceutical companies are being accused of introducing the CAPS virus so they can make money on drugs and vaccines, and have seen public faith in their products plummet. Unrest due to false rumors and divisive messaging is rising and is exacerbating spread of the disease as levels of trust fall and people stop cooperating with response efforts. This is a massive problem, one that threatens governments and trusted institutions. National governments are considering or have already implemented a range of interventions to combat misinformation. Some governments have taken control of national access to the internet. Others are censoring websites and social media content. And a small number have shut down internet access completely to prevent the spread of misinformation. Penalties have been put in place for spreading harmful falsehoods, including arrests.
Alarming news emerging from social media companies today about the CAPS pandemic. Twitter and Facebook are reporting they've identified and deleted a disturbing number of accounts dedicated to spreading disinformation about the outbreak. For more on this, we go to our correspondent, Catalina Parks.
Chen, these accounts were created by several state-sponsored groups intending to sow political discord, and some individuals are seemingly seeking to gain financial advantages. Violence against healthcare workers and minority populations has been increasing. A recent riot highlights the real danger in these posts. Countries are reacting in different ways as to how best to manage the overwhelming amounts of dis and misinformation circulating over the internet. In some cases, limited internet shutdowns are being implemented to quell panic.
How much control of information should there be, and by whom? And how can false information be effectively challenged? And what if that false information is coming from companies or from governments?
We're at a moment where the social media platforms have to step forward and recognize the moment to assert that they're a technology platform and not a broadcaster is over. They, in fact, have to be a participant in broadcasting accurate information and partnering with the scientific and health communities to counterweight, if not flood the zone of accurate information, because to put the genie back in the bottle of the misinformation and disinformation is nigh impossible.
One thing we haven't spoken about, and I'm wondering whether it's time to talk about this, is a step up from the part of the governments on enforcement actions against fake news.
My team has been monitoring the public response, and on various social media channels and cable networks, there's been some conspiracy theories that are around about the potential that pharmaceutical companies or the UN have released this for their own benefit. So as we move forward, obviously trust in pharmaceuticals and government is very important at this moment. And so as we move forward with developing the right scenarios, we have to make sure that the public communication is a major part of that because of these conspiracy theories.
As you can see, the subject of dominating and controlling information is a top priority. While I understand that fake news is and can be very dangerous and damaging, we must keep in mind that governments and the media have an extensive track record of dishonesty and selling outright lies to the public all of the time. Now, in this simulation, the Pandemic Emergency Board goes on to decide that a centralized source of information led by the World Health Organization, which falls under the United Nations, is the only way to ensure that they can control information in order to combat fake news, misinformation, and disinformation. Now, that means news reports like this one, which counter the official story, warning that a deadly virus could potentially escape a level 4 biolab in Wuhan, China, and cause an outbreak is possible. And wouldn't you know it, another coincidence? Yeah, the city of Wuhan, China is the same city where this level 4 biolab is located and appears to be ground zero of this real-world coronavirus outbreak. And currently millions of people are under quarantine as this virus is reportedly spread to more than 10 countries. Now, I urge everyone to please take all this information in with a grain of salt from every source, whether it's this channel or from your sold-out corporate media. Please do your own research. I do not have any vested interests. This channel is not monetized, so I do not profit financially or in any way, really. I do this on my own time. I have a busy life, but this is my passion, and this is what I do. Now, like any good detective, one must always ask, who stands to gain from this? Is this all just a coincidence, or is there something else going on? Now, sadly, channels like mine and many others probably will not be around for too much longer, so please be sure to follow me on alternative sites like BitChute, where I post all my videos. I'm also on Twitter. For how long is anybody's guess, so I set up an account on Gab. Now, both BitChute and Gab both pride themselves on not censoring content. You can also find my work at activistpost.com. Please share this report far and wide. For now, I will leave you with another couple clips from this pandemic simulation. I'm Spiro. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more.
I do think that there needs to be sort of an honest broker, a centralized command and control organization that really brings together the public-private sector, both on a global approach and also on a local approach.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. And I wanted to speak to the point about having the honest broker. And I think in this regard, the United Nations fits the bill.
I think a complementary tactic, too, is to tap faith-based organizations and civil society and other institutions to recruit them also to basically, almost at a grassroots level, continue to basically have the integrity of the information.
It's important that the UN and WHO remain very clear, but when they challenge governments directly, they often get into this issue of sovereignty. And so I think it's really important not to have that as the only response. I think it's really critical to think about soft power influence.
As important background for this discussion, we want to start the meeting by viewing this news story that just aired on Global News Network.
Continuing our coverage of the newly discovered CAPS disease and the scope of its deadly outbreaks, there are now more than 30,000 reported cases. Experts warn this may be just the beginning of a global problem. GNN science reporters have produced a video about what we know so far about CAPS, the virus, the outbreak, and the resulting chaos.
CAPS is a novel coronavirus related to those viruses that caused the frightening SARS epidemic in 2003 and the deadly MERS outbreaks in recent years. Scientists think each infected person in turn infects on average 2 more people. This disease is proving more transmissible than SARS or MERS and about as contagious as influenza. Essentially, the cumulative number of cases is doubling every week. At this rate, we can expect to see 16 times as many cases in a month unless we find a way to interrupt transmission. The virus appears to be spreading rapidly in densely populated and impoverished neighborhoods in some megacities in South America. CAPS is a serious respiratory disease. More than half of the recognized cases have required hospital care, creating a huge strain on healthcare systems. The fatality rate is about 10%. For comparison, CAPS is about as lethal as SARS and 2 to 4 times more lethal than the 1918 influenza pandemic, the worst pandemic on record. Even so, some people only exhibit mild flu-like symptoms, not requiring treatment in a hospital. Alarmingly, those people are able to walk around and spread the virus, not realizing they are doing so. Even worse, international travelers have been arriving at their destinations symptom-free, but within a matter of hours, becoming ill. Travel-related cases have blossomed into outbreaks in a number of locations and have quickly grown faster than health authorities could respond and contain them. In other places, physicians have quickly recognized the symptoms of CAPS and have been able to isolate infected individuals and avoid an outbreak, for now. Global public health experts are very concerned about this disease because it appears the virus is readily transmitted through the air from person to person. Essentially, all people are susceptible. Experts agree unless it is quickly controlled, it could lead to a severe pandemic, an outbreak that circles the globe and affects people everywhere. Models developed by leading public health authorities indicate a CAPS pandemic could lead to an outcome worse than the 1918 influenza, which killed 50 to 100 million people worldwide. Given the global population is 4 times larger than it was in 1918, if these models prove accurate, we could be looking at hundreds of millions of deaths over the next year or two. The outcome of the CAPS pandemic in Event 201 was catastrophic. 65 million people died in the first 18 months. The outbreak was small at first and initially seemed controllable, but then it started spreading in densely crowded and impoverished neighborhoods of megacities. From that point on, the spread of the disease was explosive. Within 6 months, cases were occurring in nearly every country. The global economy was in a free fall. The GDP down 11%. Stock markets around the world plummeted between 20 and 40% and headed into a downward cycle of fear and low expectation. Businesses were not borrowing, banks were not lending. Everyone was just hoping to hunker down and weather the storm. Economists say the economic turmoil caused by such a pandemic will last for years, perhaps a decade. The societal impacts, the loss of faith in government, the distrust of news, and the breakdown of social cohesion could last even longer.
The line between disinformation and misinformation is not always an easy one to find.
Governments need to be willing to do things that are out of their historical perspective, or for the most part, it's really a war footing that we need to be on.
It can happen quickly. A Marshall-type plan, don't mean to say that exactly, but a Marshall plan that can go into effect can stimulate change very quickly.
The distrust relates to the health system more generally.
A step up from the part of the governments on enforcement actions against fake news.
I think a couple of things we have to consider are, even before this began, the anti-vaccine movement was very strong, and this is something specifically through social media that has spread.
Welcome to Event 201.